So here we go. So today we're going to have our 10th webinar. I think it's some sort of special celebration. It's been amazing for me since starting the LLMOps.Space. We didn't really know what to expect here, and there are many different components to the events, but I think we're having both more and a bit higher quality than I expected. I'll dive into it in a bit, but I think something that I think turned out to be a very special part about the DNA of this community is that the events and materials aren't really aimed for juniors. Doesn't mean that that someone that's junior in the space can't really get anything out of them. We're kind of aiming for mid-level and senior folks. So the idea is once you already have some experience with different terms and technical areas, and potentially build some things with your hands, then it's like a different level of conversation. And it's not that this is necessarily like a better event. I just think there are less materials. And it's also fun to see that the views on YouTube are kind of, going well and so forth. So it does show there's some sort of demand for it, which is actually cool because it's like a smaller population, right? But anyway, so we'll talk a bit about LLMOps.Space. So today we're going to be talking about config driven development for LLMs. And we'll hear what that means, right? I don't think it's like a well-known term yet, but hopefully will be, depending on how good a job Sarmad and his team do at getting this, which has to do with some issues we talked about in other events also, versioning, routing, evaluating, and so forth. So we have the one and only CEO of LastMile here today. And just a reminder, please, questions on the Discord. What's special about kind of starting a conversation on the Discord and not over here is we can continue the conversation also offline, not only in real time. So on general chat within the Discord of LLMOps.Space, the link is pretty easy. So a bit about LLMOps.Space, I talked about it before, but it's a global community for LLM practitioners, and it's growing quickly. It's growing quickly, and there's a lot of content, and a lot of things are happening within the discussions there. There's a website that goes with it that has all sorts of materials. We mapped out the companies, hoping to have an updated version of this a bit later on. And the different companies and products in the space, each one are doing, each area is pretty interesting. And we have quite a few of these amazing companies. We have them kind of come here and present themselves. Something else that's a bit newer is the consultants. A lot of times in this space, you don't necessarily need people that are going to be doing consistent work for years. So we tried to map out and we enabled kind of listing, self-listing, let's call it, of consultants in the space where each person, they talked about their hourly rate and what they're offering and, how much time they have. And we were pretty strict with like what you have to fill in. So it's supposed to be useful for the community. So you can also find that on the website, and you can also find out a form for how to fill it out if you yourself are a consultant or have a close friend or family member that's a consultant. So what's the agenda for today? We're going to be talking about JSON-serializable configs, version control, management of the changes in LLMs, and we'll be talking about an open source framework, which always gets priority here at LLMOps.Space, called AIConfig. That's supposed to help build the apps better, faster, best practices, and we'll learn about it more. So let's talk. You probably know me to this extent. Just I'm most of my time I spend with deep checks, and also that we're doing this LLMOps.Space community events and so forth. Let's call it in some sort of part time. And Sarmad is joining us. He's CEO of LastMile AI, and he has a significant previous background from Meta, where he worked both on ML experimentation, model management platforms, and on the Jupyter Notebook platform. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Sarmad. And just noting this today, the event, we already have the content for it. We're always looking for amazing speakers, so feel free to either apply yourself, encourage someone else to apply, and hope to see you here at future events, both as speakers.
Thank you so much, Philip. And it's also, I am a big fan of the LLMOps community. Overall, you're doing a phenomenal job. So just wanted to call that out as well. I actually find value in a lot of these discussions as well, even as a startup founder in the AI space. So thanks for building this kind of community. So let me share my screen and we can get dive in and get started on what config-driven development really means. And a sibling of that problem, that the higher level problem everyone's really trying to solve right now is confidence in production for building AI applications. I'm sure a lot of the listeners are trying to productionize generative AI applications or features related to generative AI, and so that's kind of what LastMile AI is trying to solve for. Our job is to really try to enable software engineers and not just ML experts to be able to ship reliable generative AI applications with confidence in production. And the key observation we have is there
Okay,
are a
wait
lot
one
of
second.
software.
Sorry, Matt, on my end, I see loading in the meantime. I don't know
Oh,
if
sorry.
that
Let me see.
maybe if someone
Let
can write in the chat, if they're also seeing it, if it's just on my issue.
let me stop sharing and reshare and see if that helps. Reshare. Sorry, 1 second.
I think
All right.
yeah,
Can folks see my screen now?
yeah, just I want to say, like, as you're getting started, I'm going to be launching our first survey here. So asking uh, what's the stage of your current LLM app, where the options are conceptualization and design, development and testing, production and deployment, or optimization and scaling. So I'll let that run as you talk, Sarmad, and we'll take a little break to see the results. Today we
That
have
sounds awesome.
today we have 3 surveys. Sometimes we have 2. So you're gonna learn more about the audience.
That sounds awesome. No, I'm very curious to hear the results of that survey as well. Very topical questions to what we're talking about today. So everybody who's joining is most likely familiar with this. Especially if you've tried to build something all the way from a proof of concept for a generative AI app all the way to production, it's really hard. There are all these different steps, and this is not even the full set, but like you have to start with some kind of prompt engineering. You tune parameters, try out different models, you evaluate things ad hoc, compare different versions. At some point, you want to connect data to LLMs using different kinds of techniques, whether that's fine tuning a model or doing RAG style context injection into the prompts. Then at some point, you're happy with that, and then you deploy the model in your application, integrate it into your business app, and then have this monitoring and evaluation loop built into collecting data from production. And then this loops back in, and like you iterate on this constantly. And a lot of people we're talking to are really struggling with creating method out of this kind of chaos, because it's a lot of new steps that are added to the software development workflow for the first time. And so that's kind of what we are trying to solve.
Wait,
Also, just a quick aside on,
one second, one second. We'll take
sorry.
a break here. So we have 72% that answered. I'll be sharing the results for a second. So it's for me, it's amazing to see how there's progress from
Yeah,
meetup to meetup. I don't know if the topics are more advanced now, we're just we're getting a more advanced audience, or just the whole ecosystem is kind of moving together. So conceptualization design is just 50% of the people that answer. Development and testing 47%. Yeah, I guess it adds up to more than 100%. Production and
right.
deployment is 18%, and optimization and scaling is 20%. Yeah, and 72% participated in this poll. We'll have more polls kind of going forward, but in the meantime, I'll stop sharing and that you can continue.
Sounds great. Just a quick aside on like why confidence in production is important. Nobody needs to know this, but over the weekend, I saw this Air Canada chatbot that promised a customer a discount and incorrectly, and the judge ruled that the airline has to pay it. And it was a very interesting article. We can share that in the Discord after. But it shows that like you want to trust your AI applications and the features you add to your applications that use generative AI, and they should be reliable, and they should be predictable and reproducible.
Okay,
And so,
can you go back to the first slide for a second?
go ahead.
We got a question here about what's the ad hoc evaluation. Does ad hoc
Yeah,
uh
good question.
the
Ad hoc
React
just
is in
means ad hoc just means you're basically looking at the prompts, running them in your inner developer loop, trying out different variations, and seeing like with your eyes basically, is it doing a good job or not? And that's what the first phase of experimentation usually looks like. It's not that you've set up these massive batch test runs and you're trying to evaluate things with metrics. The first step in trying out a generative AI application is just doing prompt engineering, seeing what the results are, and like just visually observing whether things are good or bad. And so this is usually done in some kind of playground environment today. And sometimes if you have your application deployed, then you like kind of have it running on localhost or something, and you're trying to just see how the application is behaving for you locally. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Philip?
No. I would usually batch a few together, but this one
Sounds good.
I thought we would miss it.
Actually, that dovetails nicely into this. Like, what does it mean to have confidence in production? So as you try to productionize generative AI applications, the things that you really care about are one, reproducibility. Like, can I reproduce my application's behavior in a consistent fashion? This could be as simple as like setting the temperature to 0 for Gen AI models, or it could be that the data pipeline that's feeding data into a RAG-based application is consistent and reproducible, as well as the models and the settings that I'm using for the model, as well as all the application code itself. So like reproducibility can mean a lot. Like it's a line item here, but it can get very complicated. The second thing is I want to version control things so that I can really track how things are changing in my application and roll back and restore things as needed as I continue to iterate. I saw like I think 18% of people are trying to optimize and scale their application. And so version control becomes pretty important for things like that. And the final part that affects both of these two things is evaluation. I want to evaluate my application performance, both on the terms of the behavior, like for example, in that Air Canada thing, is my chatbot gonna give a fake discount, as well as guardrails around the behavior of the AI parts of your application. And then also things like performance and latency and cost tracking and all those kinds of things. Again, a single line item here, but evaluation means many, many things. But those three things together is what gives you confidence that your application is going to be reproducible, reliable, and something that can be versioned as you deploy it to production. And so today, if you look at generative AI development, all of these steps we kind of talked about, they're kind of disjoint. One, you do the ad hoc evaluation we talked about, as well as the prompt engineering and model parameter tuning in some kind of playground. There are different kinds of playgrounds. There's Vertex AI for Google, there's OpenAI playground. And so depending even on the model you're using, you may go to a different place to try stuff out. And then there's the management of those prompts. Usually people are copy pasting things from the playground, which is a chatbot, into either code or some kind of like place where they're managing their different prompts and model settings. And then everything in else is basically some kind of application development, which is all code. And so that's setting up your vector DB, that's like parsing your unstructured data to feed into to index and put in a vector database and then set up a RAG pipeline. All of those things are kind of like mishmashed into application code. And there's very little structure that kind of separates these different pieces. And it's not very methodical today. And so the problems that leads to are like, first, it's hard to evaluate and switch between model providers because you're like, there's no universal playground where you can try all of these different things. Or if like even just API wise, right? Like switching from ChatGPT to Llama, it's a whole project in itself. It's also difficult to version prompts and model settings because they're either stored ad hoc in code as like constants, or they're stored like somewhere else in some kind of service that's a managed place separately from your application code. All of this makes it very difficult to collaborate because everything is kind of a hodgepodge and mishmash of different things that's all in your application code. And so basically, you need to bootstrap your entire application in order to try out end-to-end what the application even is going to do. And what that results in is a higher cost of development. It takes longer to launch projects. It takes longer to get them into production, and you have less confidence in production when things are in production. And so the main issue in underlying all of this is that the workflow is just too ad hoc. And the only shareable artifact you have as you're building the application is the application code itself. And so this is where
So we did get a few answers that kind of pile up. So I think guardrails, I think we did mention guardrails in some other events where there were a few questions about what guardrails mean. Another question we got, if you could go to the next slide for a second. So we got a question about number 11, the plugins. What does that mean?
plugins just means data sources, for example, like you might have sources from Salesforce or Google Drive or Notion that are feeding data in. And this could be a pipeline as well. So this could be infra that's set up that's like refreshing that plugin or that data source and refetching data as it changes to feed into the RAG pipeline. In terms of guardrails, it's a great question on what that exactly means. It's usually a rules-based way, and it's number 8A on the slide over here, which is you want to define some kind of rules around how the application should behave, because by definition, generative AI applications are non-deterministic. And so there are certain things you can do. I have this thing I can share in Discord afterwards where there's a model from Facebook called Llama Guard, which allows you to define these kinds of basically safety guardrails around for example, like policies that around hate speech, or whether like certain kinds of words are allowed for the model to say or not. And that's an AI model that's acting as a guardrail model for other models. And so you can kind of like have a filter before you send a response to the user that kind of filters out things that you don't want your application to do. And so that could be like a question should not, maybe if like you ask how to assemble an illegal item like a weapon, your model may not want, you may want to make sure that your model doesn't answer that kind of question. OpenAI already has a lot of these things built into their models, but there are specific models even that you can use to define these kinds of things. And so those kinds of things become very important for brands because like that kind of behavior of an AI application, if it's non-deterministic, can result in very weird kinds of application behavior at runtime and production. And so brands want to be able to control that a lot more deeply than is possible today.
Okay, quite a few folks are answering questions over here. So I know a few people wrote that the Discord link is broken. I think for some people it did work. So I'll send another Discord link. Try this one also if you didn't manage. But please don't ask questions here. It's really hard for me to manage both of them at the same time. I do want to mention one other tool. You mentioned you mentioned the one version of guardrails. I want to mention also Nemo guardrails of NVIDIA. We also might deep checks we're working on a potential integration where you can create that a bit easier. There's also guardrails AI. I think there are some other solutions, but some of them are rule based. Some of them can be like a bit heavier and based on some sort of rule. But the principle is that it enforces the policy in production.
Exactly. And so let's talk about how we solve this. So this is just a recap, like it's disjoint today to do all this, and it's kind of ad hoc to do prompt and model management and experimentation. And so what we have created at LastMile is this open source framework called AIConfig. And the core idea here is instead of saving your prompts and models and how you invoke those models inside your application code itself, which is this top rectangle, we created this JSON and YAML config format that lets you abstract away those pieces, the generative AI pieces of the application, and store them in a version control friendly format. And so basically the AI config format is a YAML or JSON file, and it contains three things so far. One is the prompts that you're using and the prompt templates that you want to use in your application. The second is the models that you want to run with those prompts. And the third is the settings for those models. And separating that out, as we'll see in a bit, creates a lot of more structure around the development workflow. And it also simplifies your application code because the application code no longer needs to figure out how exactly to invoke a model. It just references the config and references a prompt and says like config.run. And that's all it needs to worry about. And the other thing that it enables is reproducibility, because now you can version control and manage these prompts and settings inside your own infrastructure, just like you manage your code. They could even be like side by side with your code, your application code. And that enables you to like both have rapid experimentation where you can open the config in a universal playground. I'll show this in a sec. And like within the IDE, you can have a playground that you're editing these configs in, exactly like the OpenAI playground, except that it works with Llama and local models and remote models and different providers all in one place. And the second, but more importantly, once you have these configs, you can hook them into your application code with the SDK, and just do, as you can see in the second cell, you just do config.run and you reference the prompt you want to run. And that's it. It doesn't need to know how to invoke an OpenAI model versus a Hugging Face model. All of that is kind of abstracted away from the application code. And so it creates this very nice separation of concerns between the generative AI pieces of your application, the core business logic of the application, and how to actually invoke those models and where to store them. And so let me actually switch to the demo just to show what that looks like, and then we can return to the
One second.
slides.
Before you switch to the demo, I'll do the second poll.
Go ahead, Philip.
All right, so I think through the configuration, we're understanding a bit about reliability issues. Of course, those in early POCs don't yet have them. But here, okay, so I sent, what are the largest reliability issues you're facing in your GenAI applications? So timeouts, cost spikes, inconsistent results, which has, definitely a lot to do with this area, and APIs breaking. So yeah, we have more people in the event actually in the beginning, which is fun. Yeah, look good to see that a lot of people are answering. So I'll let you continue a bit, get a bit more towards the demo. Just one issue, I know I'm being an advocate here for Sarmad's kind of, let's call it line of business or area, but starting with this type of, let's call it reliability umbrella on top of the application, it's really easy to start when your application is like new and small, and it's really
Yeah.
complex to put it in later on. So even if you don't have like a crazy need and requirement from the upper management, whatever, I think it's really interesting, just like some of the other areas, to at least experiment with it pretty early on. I think that's also what I like about this, having the significant open source component, because it's just that some things don't have to be the top priority for you to put everything aside and then spend like months on it. But if you just get the feel of what it feels like, then you can take whatever you learned into consideration when you're like thinking about the broader architecture. So I'm a big advocate of trying it quickly. Maybe if you don't listen, if you're really quick at coding, maybe you can just do what Sarmat's going to do down the demo on your own, and then not do the demo as much. But realistically, spend the extra 20 minutes after the demo to try it if you have an ongoing project, and if you don't, then take some other project. I think it's the type of thing that once you touch it for a few seconds, it's really everything's easier. It's easier to place it within other tooling systems and so forth. Okay, so I'll end the poll now. I think less people responded to this one, which makes sense because it was a bit harder to kind of describe. So 29% are experiencing timeouts as the main issue. Cost spikes is also 29%, 69% inconsistent results. These results aren't inconsistent, by the way. It's okay to be more than 100%. And API is breaking 10%.
Yeah.
All right.
This is an inconsistent results being the highest is like not surprising at all. That's definitely the hardest part of a non-deterministic system like generative AI applications are. And so like Philip said, by the way, you can try this out on GitHub as well. It's in the AIConfig repo. So what I set up here for just to show you what this is a very simple RAG application. It answers questions about the history of the United States of America and also has some prompts for generating the response as well as prompts for evaluating the generated responses across a couple of things like, is the answer relevant to the question? Is it coherent and easy to understand? Is it faithful to the context that was passed into the original prompt from the vector DB? And succinctness as like, did it answer the question in a simple way that's easy to understand? And so I'm not going to go into line by line what the IPyNB does here, but the high level idea is if you've built a RAG pipeline, it's very simple. It's very similar to what you've done before as well. So you ingest some data. In this case, it's ingesting this file, which is essentially a volume of some history of the US. and it chunks it, in this case with like very basic chunking strategy. And then it just runs like a bunch of queries that a user is giving it. The key thing though here is usually when you do all of this, you would have the prompts that you're using to generate the response and the prompt templates you're using to pass in the query and the context, all in the application code, but we've kind of separated that out. So you can see here, I'm loading this file called rag.aiconfig.yaml, which is stored right beside my my IPyNB here. And this one is, you'll see like, it looks like a notebook actually, but it's a universal notebook playground. So here I'm calling prompt with the AnyScale endpoint, and I'm running it with Mixtral. And I can specify the settings exactly like I would expect in a playground that I can. And if I just run this right now, it returns some response. The other thing you'll notice here is it's passing in, it's actually a prompt template. So there is a query and a context, which are variables that are passed into this prompt from either live data or from programmatically or from this thing called global parameters. And global parameters is just a way of defining variables. This is what I meant by ad hoc eval, where like when I'm just developing and doing the prompt engineering, I just want to see if I give it some example context, for example, here, and some example question, how would it actually respond? How would the model behave? And is the answer kind of satisfactory to what my use case is? And so here I'm trying this with Mistral
I
on,
love this, by the way. It reminds me a bit of Alfred. I don't know if you're using Alfred for Mac. I'm on a Mac, so I just save all sorts of snippets.
yeah,
It saves me so much time. So I,
right.
I
No,
really like to have it
exactly.
within a technical context, right?
And you can like add the other thing. I this is not so relevant for folks right now, but it is multimodal. So I can even like generate images as part of this pipeline. And we have examples in the repo for like multimodal kind of use cases as well. But the really powerful thing here is I have this prompt that's running against AnyScale and using Mistral. And right below it, I have a different prompt that's calling OpenAI with GPT 3.5 Turbo. And it's like a much more involved prompt on like be extremely succinct, only output your best answer. And like it's doing a lot more prompt engineering. And you can kind of even ad hoc kind of observe the differences between the different models and the performance. Underneath the covers, by the way, all of this is a JSON or a YAML file. So this is just the editor interface that is in the AI in the VS Code extension that you can install from like the extension marketplace inside VS Code. But if you actually just open this file as a text file, it looks like this. And so it's just a YAML file. It contains the prompts, the models you can see. And if you overrode some settings like temperature or max tokens or something, those would be saved here. And so now I have this basically this very nice source control friendly format for storing and iterating on my prompts. And now in my IPyNB, all I do is like do config.load for this with this YAML file. I mentioned that like query and context for you can kind of see here are passed as data from my code. So these are just variables now. And then I can just do config.run and I just reference the prompt. And in this case, the run query, like the prompt that I'm calling by default is generate v2, which is this one. So if we just run this real fast, we can kind of see it fetches data from the vector database. In this case, for this example, is using Chroma, and then it returns the final answer at the end. But the powerful thing that I really want to point out is I never specified how to call OpenAI in this code. And I never specified how to call AnyScale or Mistral in this code. There's a consistent single API that the application cares about because from the RAG application developer perspective, all I care about is I want to invoke this prompt with this data and I want a response out of it. And so that's the application code and that's what it's responsible for. And then the prompt engineering or the AI engineer who is actually responsible for crafting the prompts, they're the ones who are responsible for what it goes in the prompt, how to do the prompt engineering, right? And also hook up the model providers. In this case, we already like ship by default with all the major model providers, like so Vertex AI, Anyscale, Hugging Face, etc. But you can add your own extensions if you have like models running on your own For example, like people are using Azure OpenAI or AWS Bedrock. And so you can connect to your own instances of those models and use the same playground interface within your editor environment. And if you don't use VS Code, we also have like a CLI that sets this up on localhost. So the same experience shows up in like within your local environment. But the powerful thing now is I have a playground, which is doing my experimentation and prompt management. I have my version control, which is my YAML file that I get at the end. And I have my SDK that lets me do the application development and connect the AI config artifact to my application code. I'll pause there for a moment. The only other pieces of this that are pretty useful are, you can see that I have these like model graded eval is currently the state of the art for evaluating different kinds of generative AI behavior. And so I'm using GPT-4 here, and I have a couple of prompts that you'll see here that are evaluating the response of the application for against different kinds of metrics. So in this case, relevance, which cares about what was the answer and what was the question and was it relevant, and it should just return like a yes or no answer. Similarly, faithfulness, which is actually a hallucination metric, where you give it both the context that you fed from the vector DB into the prompt, as well as the final response. And you want to make sure that like the LLM didn't hallucinate. And so again, it can like score on that. And there are a few other prompts. But you can kind of see that I'm like managing all of those inside the config. So it's a very nice interface for me to have both the prompt that ran the generation as well as the prompt that's doing the evaluation in one thing. And I can have as many configs as I want. So I could split this out into like an eval.aiconfig.yaml that contains just the evaluation prompts. And the rest of this notebook, if folks want to try this out in your own time as well, is more about running the evals. And you can do ad hoc evaluation here where you run it like against a particular query. I have these sample queries here for what I'm trying to test out with this. There's actually a hallucination here, which is the price of flowers sold in Boston in like August versus July was different based on the context of the actual data. And it doesn't catch it, like the LLM kind of hallucinates that. And you can see what how you run the eval and kind of catch that. And in this case, it's doing this ad hoc eval. Again, back to the original question, what does ad hoc mean? Here, I'm like running it against a single query and trying it out once. But then at the bottom of this, I run it with trials and I may run like batch evals, and I have many more numbers of runs that I run for each query, and then many more queries that I run. So I have this like almost matrix of data, and then I have like statistically significant results, and I can actually like get metrics even with the model graded eval for how my application is doing across relevance, faithfulness, coherence, other kinds of metrics that I care about. So try out this IPyNB in your own time. I can get into more questions as well, but I just wanted to show you how nice and simple the flow is using AI config as the kind of artifact that you can share, because now I have this like shareable artifact that makes the LLM development a little bit more collaborative as well. And so just to show you, like putting it all back together, now with my
Just one second before you zoom out of the demo. There were quite
sorry,
a few
go
questions.
ahead,
I waited
Phil.
a bit. But first of all, it's always funner to see in code. Really,
Yeah.
definitely suitable here. So, couple of questions we got. So first of all, one question we got. Again, I'm giving priority to questions in the Discord. So the first question is a question about AI config. Can this be used to develop AI agents?
It can, exactly. That's an awesome question. We're actually working with the AutoGen team from Microsoft, where you can define a config for an agent, and you can have multiple configs that define behavior for different agents and hook it up using AutoGen to have a multi-agent application system. If that question is in Discord, I can reply afterwards, after this talk as well, to go into more details. But you can absolutely do that.
Okay, great. Another question is AI config implemented using some orchestration framework like LangChain, Llama Index, or bare bones with each model developer?
It's actually pretty bare bones. I can actually just open the GitHub to show you. So you can see the API for we've tried to keep it super simple because a lot of the feedback we've gotten from generative AI developers is Some of those other frameworks are overbearing or heavy-handed and have too many abstractions. So we try to keep it as simple as possible. And so we already ship with like OpenAI, Gemini, Anyscale, and a couple of other model providers. And you can define your own extension here. And it's a very simple process for defining, we call it a model parser. And you just define this one class basically called a model parser class that kind of defines how to construct the input and output for a model and how you run inference for that model. So that's all you really need to know how to do. And then like it works with the AIConfig interface, because then in the UI, the run function and the settings function, all of this is just querying data from that class that you define. And so you can register your own classes. You can have more complex pipelines as well. Like instead of just having a single model call, you could also have like a model parser that maybe like queries, like does a Google search and then feeds that data into a model. And you can have like more complicated pieces, but all of it is just like an implementation of this model parser class. So I can share this afterwards as well, but check out the extensions folder in the AI config repo. And it already has a few examples on how to set this up.
All right, there are a few more questions. I'll take one question here from the chat, just because I think is a good question, but please ask the questions in the Discord. So there's a question by Eddie Dulharu about, I'm guessing I didn't pronounce that right, but close enough maybe. So can you please explain how consistency is achieved within your solution?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So essentially, consistency is, sorry, just to understand, like, I think if you mean a consistency around evaluation, I know, Philip, you're also
Yeah, I can also
deep
jump in.
into evaluation, but what we're currently doing is doing something called model graded eval, which is we're letting other generative AI model kind of score the behavior and response of the LLM that ran the generation of our application. And so in that case, consistency is basically subjective based on the model itself. The next step we're taking from this actually is training our own models for some of these metrics. So we actually have a faithfulness model, which does better than GPT-4 on scoring for hallucinations, for example, where you give it the context you gave it from a vector DB, and you give it the response that an LLM produced given the context, and you get a score out of it on like how faithful was the LLM to the original data that was provided it. And so that can be a hallucination metric, and it's like a 500th the cost of running GPT-4 or GPT, even like GPT 3.5. So we'll have more model graded evals that are built on custom models going forward. Philip, anything to add for
Yeah.
consistency
So
for
I'll add
AI?
about consistency. Consistency is a tricky one because it changes infrastructure. So to say
Yeah,
consistency, at least if I want to be like very researchy about it, then consistency means basically how often will the model respond? Like, given that you asked it the same question or the same question with very small permutations, what are, how similar are the answers going to be one to each other? And how easy with a small permutation to make it say something completely different. So I think it's really hard to avoid to give a great score for this to be asking the same giving the same input many times. So that usually, I think that's why, even though it's an important metric, I think that's why you don't see it in a lot of the LLM evaluation tooling, because it does require
yeah,
like a separate architecture, which is like it's both heavy compute and it's running again and again. But I think it can be achieved like built with things like this. I just want to mention something, Sarmad, about you mentioned kind of deep checks in this area of LLM evaluation. So I think it's interesting. I think we're a lot more focused on like let's call it pre-production development and so forth. And I can
right.
imagine kind of what I mentioned, what we're now working on with Nemo guardrails of doing the same thing here, where after you play with it, and ours is a bit more UI focused, kind of. So after you get to a good way of scoring and saying, okay, let's take the hallucinations and listen them into account, could imagine
Yeah,
potentially creating a config like out within our platform. So maybe one day we'll get something like that to work between us. But in the meantime,
absolutely.
yeah. So in the meantime, I think it's really interesting to see this because I think what I think what's special about this solution is that it's a very interesting combination of not being too complex, right? Because a lot of things are happening in like JSON type format, and you can get folks that even aren't like code native growing up from zero kind of with code
Yeah.
to configure them and play with them, but it also has flexibility. It's not like pretty rigid. So I think that's pretty special here.
Absolutely. So just a quick comment on that as well. You can, if you use VS Code, just search for AI config in the extension marketplace, and you can install this. Everything I showed you is in production right now. So try it out today. Reach us on our Discord as well. If you run into any issues, but yeah, definitely give it a try. The demo I showed you is also available here in the GitHub, and I'll just like bring up this link again if folks are interested. It's just under the cookbooks folder, and it's called RAG with model graded eval. Just to put it all together, now that we have AI config as an artifact, there are a couple of powerful things that it results in. One is you, like I mentioned here and showed you, you have an editor and you can edit the AI configs visually. The point isn't that you kind of like edit these JSON files or YAML files manually. It's that once you have a config artifact, you can open it in a playground environment and you can share that artifact with your coworkers and have more of a team-driven kind of AI development workflow. And then because it's all in a config, you can also version control it, and you can also hook it up to evaluation and monitoring tools to measure the performance of it, similar to integration tests. Because if you're checking this in, like as changes happen to this config, you could have these tests that are run as part of your CI/CD. We did a blog post with Circle CI a couple of weeks ago, which I can also share in the Discord afterwards, on how you can set up a CI/CD pipeline using AI config as the artifact that you test. And because it's kind of like separated from your application code, you can have like more targeted tests for just the generative AI pieces of your application. And finally, because you have an SDK, now you can
Wait,
use this AI
just 1 second.
config artifact.
As you're talking along to the next and last poll. So what are the current obstacles holding back from releasing to production? One is evaluation, A is the evaluation, B is management of prompts and models, C is resources in the organization, and D is connecting data to LLMs because of privacy, IT constraints, and so forth. So let's let that kind of roll for a while and show the results soon. All right. So sorry for cutting you off again.
No, sounds great. So putting it all together, like now that we have this, I think I showed folks like this issue and what the state of the art for the AI development workflow is today. So with AI config, what that looks like is you do the prompt engineering, parameter tuning, the ad hoc evaluation, all within the AI config editor. What you get out of the editor is an AI config YAML or JSON file, which you can source control. So that's like prompt and model management. We're not building some service that keeps your prompts or models separate from your application code. It's meant to be right beside your application code. And then the application development itself now is a lot more structured because your prompts are kind of loaded into the application from the AI config, and how you invoke the prompts and how you run inference for those models is all stored as like an AI config extension. The application code now can just focus on the business logic of how you interact with the AI parts of your application. So you do config.load to load the right AI config, and then you just do config.run to run the right prompt. And that can include like agents, like someone asked. It could include function calling kind of things. It doesn't really matter what the underlying thing is. The key thing is that separation of concerns, that you have the application development flow, and then you have the prompt engineering and prompt management flow. And they're kind of like, they're separate now, but they're also more tied at the hip. And it's much more interactive. And that's why we also put the editor inside of VS Code itself, because we thought it is that like side-by-side inner loop kind of development workflow where you're switching constantly between your IPyNB or your Python file and your AI config, and you're editing and iterating, and you're checking them into version control. And then you have like the rest of the loop, which is around monitoring and evaluation set up for production. So I'll pause there and I'll leave some. I want to make sure there's more time for questions as well. And I'm very curious about the survey results
Yeah.
that
So
come up for the last one.
actually, I think we won't take more questions live, but we will take more questions if they come on that after the Discord. But I'll share the results over here. So as you can see, 52% said, by the way, less people answer than both of the other surveys, which I think is because the question assumes that you're like at the advanced stages, right? If you're in
Right.
conceptualization and design, then you don't none of the answers here were legitimate. Evaluation is 52%. Management of prompts and models is 26%. Connecting data to resources in the organizations 42%, and connecting data to LLMs, privacy, IT constraints, and so forth is that one we probably should have had other. I think there are other constraints and things that can kind of hold you back a bit, but it's cool to see that evaluation is a leading one, right?
Yeah,
We know it's a difficulty. I think yeah, definitely we're also spending a lot of time on this, and and yeah, and it's hard. It's a hard problem. It's hard because you have to take a lot of different things into account, and even when you know what you're taking into account, it just doesn't work a lot of the time.
yeah,
So and then there's also not just a question about like you talked a lot about how to check if a specific sample is good or isn't good. Then there's the whole area of what do I even put into my golden set? How do I manage
yeah,
it? What if I get new samples that I don't know if they're represented well? If I take too big of a golden set, my my team just won't annotate it, right? It'll kind of
yeah.
stay, and then you get lazy and not start a new version. So there a lot of things can go wrong with evaluation. I think anyone working with in the field kind of realize it's a hard problem, but it's anyway, it's great to see the results kind of reflect, I think, what we know.
Absolutely.
All right, so maybe just to conclude or a second to on your side, you want to give a few final words, and then we'll continue the conversation on Discord.
Yeah, no, first, like, thanks for everyone who filled out the survey as well. I think it is very much in line with what we're seeing in the industry as well. Try out AIConfig. Let us know what you think. I think this helps make LLM development a lot more structured. And then all the other problems that folks are talking about around, like, now how do I evaluate these things? How do I like test things out more reliably? A lot of that, once you have structure in place, you can have a more methodical approach to evaluation, to consistency checks, to reproducibility. And so, yeah, we'd love some feedback. Everything you need is in the GitHub itself. So check it out, and I'll be on Discord after this to answer some more questions.
All right,
And
great.
just wanted to thank you as well, Philip, for having me. And I love the community, like I said at the start. I think it's a great space, and hope it continues to grow.
Amen to that, and pleasure to meet you as well, and we'll be in touch.
Absolutely. All right. Have a good time,
Bye,
and
bye everyone.
I'll be in Discord. Bye.